Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being with us. And as always, as people are joining into today's Grand Rounds, we will get right into our weekly updates. And today we'll start with Dr. Megan Mahoney, a Chief of Staff, to give us some updates. Megan, thanks for being with us.
Great. Thank you, Errol, and good morning, everyone. It's just two reminders to get excited. You're invited to join on two recognition events, recognizing all the collective accomplishments that we've had over the last year. One is tomorrow at the SHC Medical Staff Awards event that's happening at 12 to 1. It's a virtual event. Several of our medicine faculty colleagues will be recognized at that event, so please join. And then also next week on the 30th, we'll have our Doctor's Day celebration, also during the lunch period. Many lunches will be distributed at 300p and 500p, and then across a number of offsite locations. So please join us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mahoney. We'll move straight over to Dr. Pinsky.
Good morning. Thanks, Errol. Brief update on our variants. We have screened around 4,000 individuals for variants and sequenced around 500. Over the last week, we've identified a number of additional presumptive B117 or UK variants. Not a lot of other variants have been identified, a couple additional E484K mutations. The California variant, or L452-R, containing the L452-R mutation, remains the most common found in our patient population. Overall, it's about 40%, you can see here. And in this epidemic curve, you can see in crimson the mutation, in gray without the mutation, and then these hexagons are the percentage. So the percentage of that mutation in our population has been rising right now. The latest data here is about 64% of all positives contain this mutation. So that's our update on variants for today, and I will take any questions in the chat.
Thanks so much, Dr. Pinsky. And moving on to Dr. Harmon, and I'll share your slide.
Thanks, Errol. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to highlight for Women's History Month this wonderful screening that has been sponsored by the NIH Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, as well as the National Heart, Lung, Blood Institute, of Picture a Scientist. This is a phenomenal documentary. It was a Tribeca Film Festival selection in 2020, and it really sheds remarkable perspectives on how to make science more diverse, equitable, and better, and features women scientists in many different fields, including Professor Jane Willenbring, who is one of the faculty here at Stanford in the Department of Geology. It is free for all online, the NIH, through this Friday, the 26th. You just have to register through a link, which we can share, and I can share that in the chat. Thank you. Back to you, Errol.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harmon. And thanks for, if you all will check out our newsletter, if you haven't seen this week, Dr. Harmon's been organizing different facts and really interesting facts about various leadership and women in our faculty, given Women in History Month. So thanks for doing that, and we'll continue to do that as well. Thanks so much. And next, we'll just briefly mention, we have next week, Dr. PJ Uch talking about the pathophysiology of COVID. He'll be talking about COVID and autoantibodies. And the week after that, we kind of have a two-part series of long COVID, where Dr. Aruna Subramanian and Dr. Leanne Williams will be talking about the clinical aspects of long COVID as well. So we're really excited for the next coming weeks to learn more about long COVID. But speaking of being excited about Grand Rounds, we have Dr. Eran Segal, who will be presenting today with us. And a special thank you to my friend and colleague, Dr. Ami Bhatt, who not only helped connect us with Dr. Segal, but also will be introducing Dr. Segal today and emceeing the whole presentation today. So Dr. Bhatt, thanks so much for being here. I'm looking forward to having you come present at Grand Rounds in the near future. Speaking of which, we have an email going out tomorrow with a follow-up for today's Grand Rounds, and we have a survey that's open that we want to get your feedback on Grand Rounds and tell us what you want, COVID topics, stuff like that. So please give us feedback on that. Dr. Bott, thanks so much for being here today and for presenting and introducing Dr. Segal.
Thank you so much, Errol, and thank you for running such a fantastic Grand Rounds for the past year. So it's a distinct pleasure of mine to introduce Eran Segal, our distinguished speaker for today's Medicine Grand Rounds. Eran is a professor of computer science and applied math at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. He received his PhD in computer science from Stanford University, where he was a Fulbright Scholar and a Stanford Graduate Fellow in the laboratory of Daphne Kohler. He then completed his postdoctoral training at the Rockefeller Institute in New York and started his independent group at the Weizmann Institute in 2005. Among the first of what I would call a new species of computer scientists who sought to solve biological mysteries, Eran has made contributions in many, many fields, ranging from epigenetics to transcriptional regulation to precision health to the microbiome and beyond. Eran's current research focuses on understanding the role of the human microbiome in health and disease, with the aim of developing personalized medicine approaches that combine human genetics, the microbiome, and nutrition. He and his group have developed and applied a multidisciplinary approach that combines both experimentation and computation, and they've been very successful in developing and following large-scale human cohorts in both healthy and various disease settings, both with and without interventions. Today, Eran will share his COVID-focused research with us, which has greatly informed Israeli practices and policies during the pandemic. On a personal note, Eran is an absolutely delightful colleague. He is generous with his time and his sage advice, and he's a brilliant and dedicated mentor. Many of his trainees have gone on to impactful careers in academia and industry, and the ripple effect of Eran's expansive and incisive vision is visible across the field of precision medicine. Eran, thank you very much for making the time to join us at Stanford Medicine Grand Rounds, and I wish you a very warm virtual welcome back to Stanford.
Thank you very much, Ami, for this very kind introduction, and thanks for Errol as well for the invitation to speak here today. Can you just make sure that you can see my screen?
We can.
We can, okay, great. Yeah, about I guess a year ago, I returned from a microbiome conference in San Diego, and right when I think we had in Israel just the first few patients identified in Israel, and it was clear that something big is starting to happen. And like many other scientists, we sought to see where we could possibly contribute. And so for the past year or so, my lab and I have been doing quite a lot of work on COVID-19. I'd like to share with you some of these experiences, and I think some of the approaches and models that we've developed may be applicable in other countries and settings. I would say this is the view of the pandemic in Israel. The three waves that we had were, in retrospect, obviously the first wave is just a very, very tiny bump compared to what we've seen after that. And I'd like to share with you in this talk three main things that we've been developing. One is based on surveys of symptoms that we've developed in the first wave and gave us quite some insight. Towards the second wave, we started to develop models that predict the future dynamics of the pandemic, mostly with respect to critically hospitalized patients, and I'll mention why we went into that. And then in the final part, we've been focusing on analysis of the effect of the vaccines on the global numbers here in Israel. When this outbreak just started, we thought that, as you may recall, testing was very limited. In Israel, we were doing about 1,000 tests per day. Now we're doing 100,000 tests per day. So testing was very limited, and still we wanted to obtain a global view of what is going on in the pandemic. And so we thought that one useful way of doing that would be to use population-wide surveys. And so we developed these surveys very rapidly, and we deployed them. Overall, we obtained millions of answers to these. We designed them to be very, very quick, so that you can fill them out in just under a minute. And mostly we employed them in the first wave as a way to obtain information that we thought could be done very cheaply, so essentially at zero cost. And if people are compliant, then you could really get a full national view in real time even. And since symptoms develop before you begin testing, then that can really have major advantages to identifying outbreaks before they occur. Of course, that requires compliance. We had that a little bit during the first wave, but then that compliance was lost during the second and wave and beyond. But I think still these types of tools could be very useful. So we developed just a very simple app where you're just asked for some background information. We made sure that these are anonymous. We had no intention of identifying people at the individual level. We just wanted to know their general region and just some background information of certain background diseases that they have, because that could be predictive of the severity of COVID-19. And we asked people about any symptoms that they had, like loss of taste and smell, and fever, and coughing, and so on. So this allowed us to then basically build these maps, these geographical maps that were colored according to the average symptom rates that were reported in different regions. And throughout this, the initial period of time, we were able to basically use these symptom surveys to obtain a real-time view of high-risk outbreak regions. We were able to predict some of the outbreaks days before they actually occurred. And I'll show you also that they were very informative early on when people didn't really have a good understanding of what are the most common and distinctive symptoms of COVID-19 to obtain some insights around that. So we deployed the system very rapidly, I think within days since we started, and we continuously improved it. It was filled out in Israel by over 3 million different people, which is quite a lot in a population of about 9 million people. And we used it to build these symptom maps. In addition, we collaborated with several other researchers, including people in the US and 12 countries altogether, to form what we call the Coronavirus Census Collective, a consortium that whose plan was to deploy these surveys and to share methods and insights of doing that. I'll just show you one slide here of the names of the cities are in Hebrew, but the x-axis shows the actual confirmed cases on some date on between April 1st and 3rd. And then a few days before that on the y-axis was what we obtained for these very same cities in terms of the average rates of symptoms. And you can see that there's quite a good correlation allowing us to basically predict several days ahead of time which cities would have outbreaks, and especially when testing was limited, to help our Ministry of Health deploy the testing to these locations. The other thing is that we were able to use these surveys for was to just follow and track the dynamics of the development of symptoms before and after you apply restrictions such as a lockdown. And obviously in March, a lockdown was a historical event in Israel and I guess in the world. And so we could use these symptom surveys to basically track the level of symptoms that people are reporting. And so if we normalize to 1 the rates of symptoms that we start with, what this allowed us to do was to track the dynamics. How long does it take and what are the dynamics of decline in symptoms as you employ lockdown? You can see that there's several days after the lockdown imposed on March 18 of 2020 until we began to see about a week later a decline in symptoms. And you can see the rate of which we see these declines over a period of 2 weeks. We can break it down further into the actual specific symptoms. And I think this is interesting and probably even more generalizable to the effect of lockdowns on various symptoms and how rapidly they decline as you employ restrictions. And using the same approach, after the restrictions were lifted, we could see then a rise in symptoms as infections started to grow. not just for COVID-19, obviously, but in general. And we could see also the dynamics of different types of symptoms and how fast they come back. The other thing that we developed was an algorithm that basically allows us to better make use of the symptoms reported to identify patients who we should prioritize first for testing. And again, this was very useful when testing was limited, but I would say even today, just using a very simple online tool, this algorithm can identify people whose symptoms are most likely due to COVID-19 and not due to other reasons. And so the way we developed this was to use both our online surveys as well as an interactive voice response survey that we deployed in several cities and got a high rate of compliance. And then one of the questions was, in addition to filling out the symptoms, was whether you are now, whether you have now been tested positive for COVID-19. And from that, we could develop an algorithm where I'm showing here some standard performance metrics of area under the curve. And 0.5 is random guessing, and we're doing about 0.74. Obviously not perfect. If we were doing perfect, you wouldn't need to do the actual testing. But if you notice, the sharpness of these curves at the very beginning indicates that above some score, the model identifies people that really have a very high probability. If you test them, they have an even greater than 50% probability of being testing positive. So above some threshold, we could identify the really high-risk individuals that probably should be even quarantined before they do the testing. So I think this type of tool could still be useful today. We also collaborated within our consortium with groups in the UK, Sweden, and the US, and we showed that the models developed on the population in Israel also were successful in predicting who we should prioritize for testing in these other countries. Kind of going under the hood in terms of the model, it also provided insights as to which symptoms are most distinctive for COVID-19 infection. By now, this is well known, but at the time, this was not well known. And we saw that loss of taste and smell was by far the most distinctive feature. So it's prevalent in about 20–25% of COVID-19 patients, but it's very distinctive. You barely find it in people who are not infected who are not COVID-19 patients. Whereas, for example, if you compare fever, which we know is also a feature that's relatively prevalent in COVID-19 patients, it's not a distinctive feature. There are many different reasons why you would have high fever. So this allowed us to identify features, and actually at the time, based on these surveys, we convinced with this data our Ministry of Health to prioritize and let people get tested if they reported loss of taste and smell. At the time, it wasn't a symptom that granted you a test. And we could also see that the importance of these different features varied by age. So for older people, the distinctiveness of these different features was even more pronounced. The other thing that we examined was also kind of a bit on a longer time scale, not really the long COVID, but just the several weeks before and after you test positive. What are the symptoms that seem to rise? And we identified, again, loss of taste and smell, and could even quantify the dynamics of it, where we saw that even for a period of 2 or 3 weeks after you test positive, so even long after your infectious window, you still exhibit this symptom of a loss of taste and smell. So I think these surveys were useful at the time. I think that maybe even now, and also definitely for future pandemics, I think these types of tools that are really free and very easy to employ could provide valuable insights and really let us obtain a national view. I think it's the only tool that allows one to obtain a national view of the situation, of course, if you are able to convince people to make use of it. So overall, I would say that Israel handled the first wave quite well, in the sense that it closed its borders very early on, which helped a lot. It imposed a lockdown, a very strict one that people by and large obeyed to. And that really crushed the curve, and we were down to, at some days, even single-digit numbers, which we never came back to until this very day. But after that, Israel had a plan which sounded reasonable, and the plan was basically to identify regions of outbreak and then impose restrictions and lockdowns locally on these regions. So there was an entire traffic light plan, it was called, here to do that. And the only problem is that our government was not able to follow and enforce that plan. So what we saw rises locally. We were able to pinpoint and say where these rises are occurring. And it was clear that restrictions should be applied. They were directed, that there were directives to employ them, but they were not enforced. And so what happened in reality is that these rises, which initially were local, then they spread out throughout the country. Israel is a very small country, so within weeks, local outbreaks could spread to the entire country, and that's exactly what happened. And as that happened, it was clear that the next worry is that hospitals will get filled up. And so the government defined a threshold, and the threshold was 800 simultaneous patients in the ICU, severely critically ill patients. That was defined as the capacity of the healthcare system. And essentially, the government didn't say that, but essentially it started to manage the pandemic according to that threshold. So the idea was not to get to that threshold. And of course, like with a deadline, when do you submit something? You submit it always at the deadline. Similarly, when you define a capacity of the healthcare system, you're bound to reach it, which therefore, in my view, is not a very good strategy to manage the pandemic, but that was the reality. And so when that was the reality, we thought that it would be critical to be able to predict the future of how many critically ill patients we will have, because as we all know, any action that we take, even enforcing a lockdown, it takes at least 2 weeks until we begin to see the effects of that action. So you really need to predict ahead of time when you'll reach that number. So that number, as I mentioned, was 800. We indeed reached beyond that number, and we developed models, which I'll talk about now, where basically in the beginning, in the middle of September, when the number of patients in the ICU was around 550, we predicted that even if you enforce a lockdown today, we will overshoot and we will reach even 800-900 patients in the ICU. We reported that to government and to the Ministry of Health. And I think based on our reporting, based on others, a good decision at the time was made to go into a strict lockdown. This was our second lockdown, and indeed, we really reached this number of about 900 patients in the ICU in the middle of September. So what was this model? So if you think about trying to model the number of concurrent patients in the ICU, you basically need two main components. You need to understand the dynamics of those who test positive, at what time scale, how many days it will take, and what fraction of those testing positive will reach the ICU. And then once in the ICU, you need to model the dynamics of who will die, who will get ventilated, who will get released, in order to get a model of what are these dynamics. So the way we did that was to develop these two components. We basically obtained all of the historical data, the trajectory of every single patient ever testing positive, whether it ended with just testing positive, which obviously is the majority of people in Israel, but then some fraction go to the hospital. And so we had all of these trajectories also across time. And so we could build these statistical graphs of lines here corresponding to each age group and gender, which we know are determinant factors in the probability of testing positive to being hospitalized. And so, for example, this top curve here shows the probability as a function of time from being testing positive that you will reach the ICU. We can see that it actually starts at 20%. And the reason for that is that 20% of males above the age of 90, they actually get diagnosed with COVID-19 just when they come to the hospital because they're feeling bad. So that's why these curves don't start at 0. And then we can see the dynamics of how they go up. And basically, if after 10 days you didn't reach, you weren't hospitalized, then the likelihood that you will get hospitalized after that really diminishes. But for males above the age of 90, it's a 50% chance that if they test positive for COVID-19, they'll get hospitalized. That number goes down, obviously, as we know, as a function of age. And when we have all the statistics of that, so that's one component of the model. And the other component is to model really the dynamics of what goes on in the hospital. So from that, we could build these probability tables of, given that a patient and relative to and taking into account his gender and age, given that a patient enters the hospital, what is the probability of that patient being released after being ventilated, dying, or dying after being ventilated. And we can see that here too, the dynamics are, if you basically survive the first 10 days in the ICU, then the probability of dying goes down dramatically. So here too, we could build these statistical graphs relative to the age group and gender of the probability of either dying or being released as a function of time in the ICU. And then to make it simple, basically multiplying these two probability tables, the transition from testing positive to being hospitalized, and from being hospitalized, the number of days that it would take for you to either be released or to die, using the product of these two matrices basically can give you the number of concurrently hospitalized patients in the ICU. And so we employed this model. We provided, and still to this day, every single week, we give a forecast, a 1 week ahead forecast to the Ministry of Health. It's always given as these gray bars here, so always as a range. Obviously, there's a margin of error. And that's shown here by the gray bars, and the red dots indicate the actual number of hospitalized patients 1 week later. And you can see that by and large, these predictions were fairly accurate throughout the pandemic. We also posted them for the general public on Twitter as we gave them to the Ministry of Health. So these were basically available to everybody. And the model also had, we then made the model a bit more complex by using a multi-state competing risk model that really models better all the transitions between the different parts here, different stages that one could go through. And that really allowed us to also use the model to make predictions 1 week ahead of time. And we could go even further than a week, of not just the number of people in the ICU, but how many would be severely ill, critical ill, mild or moderate, and how many would die. And turns out that actually the predictions for death were very accurate. If you look at the big numbers, and obviously for a single patient, it's not very accurate, but by and large, for statistically, these predictions were very accurate. And that allowed us to make another analysis, which I think had also quite a lot of impact in understanding what is the actual capacity of the healthcare system. I mentioned that it was defined as 800, but what I'll show you is that we actually discovered that once Israel, throughout the entire country, reaches above 500 COVID-19 patients who are severely ill at the same time, we believe that once we pass that number, we begin to see a decline in the quality of care, and basically we exhibit excess death. People who, even given their status of the disease, once hospitalized, given their gender, given their age, some people that should not have died if they did not come at a period where the load on the hospitals was so high. And the way in which we did that was basically to use this model. And what we did was we took the time period in which the load on the hospitals was not so high, so below 500, just before our big second wave. And we developed the model at this time. And what we found is that this model predicted very accurately the number of deaths. And then what happened is that once the load passed 500, then there was a gap. The model made some predictions, but the actual number of deaths was higher, about 25 25% higher. And then this very same model trained on the parameters from before the second wave, after the lockdown was imposed and numbers went down, this very same model came back to making very accurate predictions. And then once the third wave started and the load on the hospitals increased again, then this model again under-predicted the actual number of deaths. So we take this to be indicative that once Israel passed 500 concurrently severely hospitalized patients with COVID-19, then the quality of care to these patients goes down, and we exhibit excess death. We exhibit about 25 to 30% death that should not have occurred, probably for people even given their age and status of hospitalization. So, in this we published. There's a paper that in Nature Communications on this model and insights, and I think this was quite impactful in terms of the insights on the load of hospitalization here in Israel. After the second wave, our numbers started to go down, but then we started to lift the restrictions, and then numbers started to climb. The vaccines were just coming out, and it was then essential to basically model what could we do in terms of lifting the restrictions, what would be the race between the effect of the vaccines and the rise in cases that we were expecting to see once restrictions would be lifted. So we tried to model these longer term scenarios. And the other thing that came along was the UK variant, the B117 variant started to appear in Israel. We didn't know at what prevalence it was at the time when we modeled. And this was critical because, of course, the higher the prevalence, the faster we would see it spread. And so in the race between the vaccines and the B117 variant, which we know is 30 to 50% more infectious, that was very critical. So we started to build these scenarios, which were very critical and were presented to the government, very critical in making the decisions under all of these uncertainties. The uncertainties around the effect of the vaccines, which were not really known at the time. They were known just from the Pfizer controlled experiments, but not in real life scenarios. And also some of the parameters around the B117 were unknown. So we made these models that tried to predict all the way to the end of March what would be the dynamics in terms of both the infectivity rate R, the positive cases, the severely ill, and the cumulative death. And these are what we presented, and we found under these models that even at some very optimistic parameters for the effect of the vaccines, and even under some optimistic parameters of the deployment of the vaccines, we would still require a very strict third lockdown in order to beat the B117 variant. And so we recommended, and indeed this is what our government did, was to impose a third lockdown even 1 week after we started vaccinating, which was very hard for the public to accept, that once the vaccines arrived, we're still going to a lockdown. But even in retrospect, this, I believe today, and is the consensus here, was definitely the right decision, because even under a very strict lockdown, vaccines that we know today are very effective, a rollout program that was really phenomenal. In Israel, we still had a third wave, which was bigger than any wave that we had before. The number of ICU people in the ICU concurrently was much higher than it was in the second wave. We actually reached 1,200, and as I showed you, there was also excess death due to that, probably due to that. So this was essential, and this also came out of the modeling. And so the final in the final few minutes, I want to take you through just a few of the analyses that we've been doing to understand the effect of the vaccines, and I think some graphs that I anticipate you would also probably see very soon in the US. So first of all, in terms of just the rollout of the program, I mentioned it's been really phenomenal. Today, if you look at the number of people at different age groups who were either vaccinated fully or with the first dose, or those who've recovered. It's really reaching remarkable percentages. And overall, I think today, over 90% of people above the age of 16 who are eligible to get the vaccine either got it or have recovered from COVID-19. These are the dynamics kind of over time. During the peak of dosings, Israel reached about 1.5% of the population being vaccinated on a single day. Actually, I think even a bit higher than the numbers. I believe the over 3 million record that you have in the US, which is also a very remarkable number. And so in analyzing the effect of the vaccines, this was really very critical to do in Israel, because we really had a situation where the number of people in the ICU was very, very high, and there was a lot of pressure to release to lift some of the restrictions, and you really needed to understand whether the vaccines are having an effect in real life, which given that Israel was by far the furthest to vaccinate its population compared to other countries, we really had nobody to learn from. And this was somewhat tough to analyze, because concurrently with the vaccination, we also had a third lockdown. And we know that the lockdown also has an effect. So what we did was to take advantage of a natural experiment that was done in Israel, which was to vaccinate the older people first. So in Israel, people above the age of 60 were the first group that got vaccinated, and that happened for about a period of 1 month. And so we could compare the declines on these different curves: the age group above the age of 60, the age group of 50 to 60, 40 to 50, and then 20 to 40, according to the time at which these age groups were getting the vaccine. And really, we saw a deviation. We started to see a deviation of these curves. The age group of 60 declined before. I'll show you in a moment. We did not see this occurring during the second lockdown. These curves behaved the same. And so given, as soon as we saw that, these two curves kind of separating, we told both government, we also put on Twitter that we think we are now beginning to see the effect of the vaccines on the real world numbers. So we posted on Twitter, we say, with caution, the magic has started. Obviously, it's not magic, it's science, but given the situation that we were at, it was very exciting to see. So we just thought it's a magical moment. And so if you look here on these curves, it's a busy slide, but basically on all aspects of cases, hospitalizations, severely ill, on all of these accounts, we saw these curves separating by age groups, which was to us an indication that the vaccines are really happening are really having an effect on real life numbers. These are all the numbers, all these graphs shown here for the third lockdown when the vaccines were given. And I'll show you now the exact same curves, but for the second lockdown, and you can see that these curves are right on top of each other. So again, that was for us, really the indication that it's the effect of the vaccines. I'll skip this slide, but I'll just mention that since our peak of mid-January, the daily rate of death from COVID-19 has dropped by over 90%. So the effect of the vaccines has really been remarkable. And this is just a visual to show what has been going on. You can see on the left panel here, the percent of people in each age group who were vaccinated. You can see the age group of 60 and above being vaccinated first, followed by the 50 to 60 and so on. And in parallel to that, you can see these curves really starting to go down, also by order by the order in which the vaccines were given, which I think is quite impressive and remarkable. The other prediction that we made was in kind of thinking about what would happen ahead of time when you give the vaccines. We also thought that what we would see is a change in the composition of the ages of people who get hospitalized, because as you begin to protect the older age group, that group will be protected, and so the distribution should shift towards younger people being hospitalized. And so on January 10, we put out this graph. We also posted it on Twitter, where we made a prediction that going from a stability of about 75 to 80% of patients in the ICU being above the age of 60, we thought that within 2 weeks, we would see a drop to only about 47% of people above the age of 60 being severely hospitalized out of the 100%. And these predictions actually turned out to be quite accurate. So in the end, we reached not 47%, but 51%. So that number is quite close. The one thing that did happen is this decline did not occur over a period of 2 weeks, but over a period of 4 or 5 weeks. And we attribute that to something we did not think about ahead of time, which is the characteristics of the people who get vaccinated. And I believe that in retrospect, those who rushed first to get the vaccine were those who to begin with were the more cautious people. So from the perspective of the pandemic, vaccinating that population is going to have a very small effect on the overall numbers. And it's only when you begin to vaccinate more and more of the people who are kind of who have more interactions, who maybe are less cautious, that you begin to see this effect. So it took a longer time period, but it eventually happened. And it's also possible that the effect of the vaccines in real life really starts to kick in stronger after 1 or 2 weeks after the second dose. That's another possibility. So I'll skip these in the interest of time. I'll just mention that we also saw effects on teenagers who we began to vaccinate. So another natural experiment that was done here, both for people in the army and people at high school to allow them to resume activities. And we saw that these age groups declined in infections, not in hospitalizations, in infections, far more than their similar age groups who were not vaccinated at the time. And I'll show this just this last slide. This is where we are today. When we compare, and I think it's very impressive, this is showing the infectivity rate, R, which we all know when it's above 1, the pandemic is expanding. When it's below 1, on average, each person transmits the virus to less than 1 person, and the pandemic is contracting. And you can see that in blue here, after the second wave, when day 0 is lifting of the restrictions, we can see R beginning to go up and actually never coming down until a third lockdown was imposed. And in contrast, now that we have the vaccines, after exiting the third wave, there was a period of when people were nervous because R initially went down, but then it started to go up. But then really the effect of the vaccines kicked in. And to this very day, R is still going down. We're now at an R of, actually today it's even 0.59. It's the lowest contraction rate that Israel has seen since the beginning of the pandemic. And I can tell you that the economy here in Israel now is the most open that it was. It's actually nearly fully open today, the most that it was since the beginning of the pandemic. So really remarkable. We still have restrictions of wearing masks, but which I think is the safe thing to do, given that Israel is the first to try and open up when we have a pandemic, but numbers are still contracting, and so far things are looking quite good. So with that, I'll just put the acknowledgement slide. This is my group who on normal days is working on, as Ami mentioned, the microbiome and personalized medicine approaches, but really I want to mention 3 PhD students, remarkable students, Madar Shilo, Tomer Meir, and Weizmann, who led our COVID-19 studies. And with that, I'll stop and be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Eran, for a really fantastic presentation, very far-ranging and so impactful. Questions have already started to roll in, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. The first question is posted in the Q&A from Rob. He asks, can these symptom surveys be used for surveillance long-term to monitor for the next global pandemic? And he notes that, he imagines that the strategy might be limited by participation in the survey. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and also thoughts on how to encourage people to participate.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think that in retrospect, these are very useful tools, and actually they've been employed. We're not the first to employ them. They've been employed for tracking the flu, and I think for for other things. So I think that definitely use of these tools, and now in the digital era, it could be done. It should be done, and it could be done very easily. And I think it is a challenge to have people comply. We tried in the first wave to convince, we had a goal of having our prime minister or the head of the Ministry of Health tell people every day that, fill out the survey. It takes just, it actually takes 15 seconds to do it after you've done it the first time. We weren't able to reach that at the time, but I think it, so I think there's a tremendous potential for that. Also for tracking, long COVID-19 symptoms and for many different things. I think these tools in general have been really underemployed in this pandemic, and I think they could be very useful, but it really takes, I think a government organization to really tell and inform the public of how useful these tools could be.
Great, thank you. So a follow-up question to that, this is coming from Dr. Angela Rogers. She notes that it seems like the interaction between science and government led to rapid changes in policy. I'd love to hear a little bit about how this all unfolded and how you, as a microbiome and genetics researcher, ended up both transitioning into this field and also engaging very closely with the government to impact policy at a very early time point.
Yeah, so I would say at least in Israel, there was kind of a void that basically, obviously, I think dealing with COVID-19 has been a scientific effort on two main fronts. One front is dealing with the uncertainty and the analysis of the big data and the numbers, having much less to do with the actual biology of the virus. And the other, obviously, the whole development of the vaccines and understanding the immune response and so on. So we focused on the first part where our expertise also lies. And in that sense, there was, in Israel at least, really a void. And the Ministry of Health really sought to researchers who have some experience in that. And so we took on ourselves this challenge. And I think once we started to post our predictions and they fared quite well with reality, then the politicians really wanted to engage, and the Ministry of Health wanted to engage and formalize these relationships. And so we frequently presented these in governmental meetings. And I think this, and as well as some models by a few other groups here in Israel, really formed the basis for those discussions in trying to make decisions. Obviously, these models are just a tool to inform policymakers, because policymakers need to take into account many different aspects together, but at least this aspect of what would be the dynamics of the pandemic and what risks they would be taking if they open up and so on. These are things that they really needed to understand, and I think I'm glad we were able to contribute a bit to that.
Great. So a related question to that, asked by Dr. David Spiegel, what are the regulations around travel into the country, and how are these models impacting future plans to open up borders, enable travel, et cetera?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because actually in retrospect, Israel did a really good job at handling the borders on the first wave, but not since then. And that really allowed the B117 UK variant to enter somewhere around December. And actually, according to our models, if that strain did not enter, and we actually presented models before that strain, before we knew about that strain, that we could actually pass through with the vaccines without the requirement for a third lockdown. So in retrospect, this was Israel paid a very, very heavy price, both in death toll and also in a third lockdown. So economically wise, for allowing this B117 to enter. And that has kind of traumatized decision policymakers. And so Israel really is now very, very much more strict on its borders. And I think still the worry is not really so much the actual cases that will be brought in every day, but it's really just the worry of the variant. So now there are certain plans to think of how can we still open the sky and let people travel without going into quarantine if they're vaccinated once they enter Israel, while still doing enough testing to make sure that variants are not allowed to enter. Obviously, we know that the only way to ensure 100% that you're not letting variants enter is to just close down the borders entirely. But otherwise, you're taking some risk, and the idea is to do testing so that you minimize as much as possible this risk of allowing other variants to enter.
Excellent, thank you. So this leads to our follow-up question from Dr. Thomas Burns. What is the current status of the variants that exist in Israel? And can you tell us a little bit about the surveillance plan that is in place to try and detect and measure the prevalence of these variants?
Yeah, so currently the dominant strain here in Israel is the B117. This is by far probably approaching 90% or above. And so I think the fact that the numbers are going down is indicative of the vaccines being very effective against the B117 strain. We also have the South African strain. We don't know exactly its prevalence. At some point it was around 1%. And so also the fact that this strain, that we're seeing the numbers going down, and really still the several people who are hospitalized critically every day, only a very small fraction of them have been vaccinated. So either that strain is not very prevalent, and we know it existed, so it was not able to spread very rapidly, and or the vaccines are somewhat effective against it, and we know that they are effective to some degree against that variant. There is, I believe, there were detections of the variant from New York here in Israel, but at some amounts. And the surveillance plan in general is to see those very few patients who get hospitalized but have been fully vaccinated. They can be suspect of maybe carrying some variant that eluded the vaccine. So the part of the plan is to obtain samples from these hospitalized and vaccinated patients. We don't have many of them, and hopefully we will not in the future, but that will be part of the plan. And the other is, as I mentioned, on the borders to do testing, and and those who are tested positive to see which strains they carry.
Great. So the next question is from Dr. Michelle Berry. She asks, how are the ultra-Orthodox doing vis-a-vis control and participation? And a related question from Tal Rusak, also wondering about the vaccine rates in different population groups within Israel.
Yeah, so two excellent questions. For lack of time, I did not go into the various sectors here in Israel, but actually that really drove the pandemic. The ultra-Orthodox had a much higher rates of infections, having to do probably with two different reasons. One is an objective reason. These are populations that have larger families, so more kids, and so much more, and they live in densely populated areas. So I think objective reasons why that population would have more infections, but also probably less compliance. And we saw, if you look at people above the age of 60, there was a very heavy death toll price that the ultra-Orthodox paid. It was over 1% of all people above the age of 60 from the ultra-Orthodox have died of COVID-19, compared to only 1 in 350 from the general population. We also saw the Arab population suffered for similar reasons from a lot of infections, and there also it was 1 in 140 people above the age of 60 have died of COVID-19. So, but given these very high rates of infection, we actually predicted following the third wave that essentially we really reached, I don't want to use the term herd immunity, but we really reached the capacity of infections that could occur in the ultra-Orthodox combined with the vaccination. And that really has been the situation. And now this population has really declined very rapidly. And essentially there are now very few infections there. And so related to that, to the second question that you asked, the rates of the vaccine have also been, and I predict this is probably going to happen in many other countries as well, there's really been a strong positive correlation between socioeconomical status and rates of the vaccine. And so the ultra-Orthodox and also the Arab population have much lower rates of vaccination compared to the general population. And I think this is one of the aspects that needs to be improved here in Israel.
Yeah, I think that highlights a major issue around the world, that of kind of equitable access to both disease prevention and disease treatment. So this really has highlighted, I think, global inequities. So with that, we have many more questions, but unfortunately we have come to the end of our hour. And so I wanted to thank you once again for a really fantastic presentation. Thank you all for your questions. And we look forward to your continued work.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Much. Bye-bye.